Bubble Witch Podcast, Episode 9, Lammas, Week 4, What We Carry Forward. Welcome back, friends. I'm glad you're here. Wherever this little conversation has found you today, I hope you've managed to steal a few quiet moments for yourself. Maybe you're sewing, maybe you're driving, maybe you're folding another basket of laundry that mysteriously appeared overnight, or maybe you finally sat down with a cup of tea that's still warm. However you found your way here. Welcome. Last week we talked about hearth, not fireplaces or beautiful stone chimneys, but the places where our hearts naturally settle, the places that make our shoulders relax just a little, the spaces where we create, where we gather, where we remember who we are when the rest of the world gets noisy. I've thought about that conversation quite a bit this week, mostly because I realized that one of my own hearths isn't actually a place at all. It's a habit. Every Sunday, my son and I meet for tea, usually at Aristocats Coffee House here in our town of Spavinaw. Now, if you've never been there, it's one of those places that just encourages you to slow down a little. Nobody's rushing you out the door. The tea is wonderful, the atmosphere is cozy, and for an hour or two every Sunday, that's where our week begins. Or maybe where the old one ends. I'm not really sure which. We don't call it a business meeting. That would make it sound far more organized than it really is. There's no conference table, no PowerPoint presentations, no pie charts. Just 2 cups of tea, usually something sweet to nibble on, a notebook, and 2 people talking about life. Of course, we talk about business. That's unavoidable these days. We'll go over the birthday parties from the week before, talk about bubble shows, face painting, products that are finished, products that still need a little love. We'll throw ridiculous ideas onto the table just to see if they survive the conversation. Some of them do. Some of them quietly wander off into the great field of, well, that sounded better in my head. Honestly, those are some of my favorite conversations, because nobody is trying to impress anybody. We're just dreaming out loud. Sometimes one tiny idea grows into something wonderful. Sometimes we both laugh so hard we forget what we were talking about in the first place. Both are perfectly acceptable outcomes. But somewhere in the middle of all that conversation, without even realizing it, we've developed a little rhythm. We always end up asking the same kinds of questions. What worked this week? What didn't? What made us excited? What completely drained the life out of us? What deserves another week of our time? And what should probably be left exactly where it is? Sometimes the answers are obvious. Sometimes they're a little harder. Sometimes we realize we've spent entirely too much energy trying to make something work that simply wasn't meant to. And sometimes we discover that the thing we almost talk ourselves out of ended up becoming our favorite part of the week. Those Sunday conversations have become something I look forward to, not because we solve every problem. Believe me, we don't. Life has a funny habit of laughing at our carefully written plans, but because they give us permission to pause before charging into another busy week, to notice, to reflect, to sort through everything we've been carrying. And while I was reading through this week's chapter in the little book of Lammas, it suddenly hit me. We've accidentally been practicing Lammas every single Sunday, because that's really what this week of the season is all about. Not gathering, not celebrating, not even harvesting, sorting. Looking at everything you've gathered during the season and asking, what is actually feeding me? What is simply taking up space? What deserves to come with me? What am I finally ready to set down? I love that this chapter doesn't ask us to dramatically reinvent our lives overnight. In fact, one of my favorite lines says this week isn't about reinventing your entire existence by Tuesday. Thank goodness. Because I don't know about you, but I already had plans for Tuesday. Instead, it's an invitation to notice. Nature does this every year. The trees don't try to hang on to every single leaf forever. Gardens don't keep producing endlessly. Fields don't apologize when the harvest is finished. Everything begins deciding what comes next. Not with panic, not with guilt, just quietly, gently. There's something comforting about that. I think we humans sometimes believe we have to carry everything, every responsibility, every obligation, every old version of ourselves, every project we've ever started, every expectation we've ever accepted, as though setting something down somehow means we've failed. But nature doesn't see it that way. Nature understands that making room is part of growing. And maybe we're allowed to understand that too. You know, one of the activities in this week's chapter of the Bubble Witch's Little Book of Lammas is called the Nourishment List. It's wonderfully simple. Take a journal page and divide it into 2 columns. On one side, write, "What nourished me?" On the other, "What drained me?" That's it. Simple. But not always easy. Because I think most of us can list everything that drained us in about 30 seconds. We remember the difficult customer, the traffic, the bills, the laundry, the appointment we forgot, the project that took 3 times longer than we thought it would. Those things have a way of announcing themselves. They're loud. The nourishing things, they tend to whisper. Sometimes they're so ordinary we almost don't notice them at all. And I think that's why I enjoy those Sunday afternoons with my son so much. Yes, we talk about business. We probably spend more time talking about Bubble Witch and Pixie Productions than 2 reasonably sane people should. We'll spread notebooks across the table, talk about birthday parties that are coming up, face painting events, bubble shows, which products are almost finished, what needs photographed, what needs listed, the next podcast, future ideas. Sometimes we'll chase one little idea around the table for 20 minutes just to see where it goes. Sometimes that idea grows into something real. Sometimes it politely thanks us for our time and disappears forever. Both outcomes are perfectly acceptable, because that's what brainstorming is supposed to be. Not every seed becomes a sunflower. Some ideas simply help another idea grow. I've learned not to mourn every idea that doesn't work out. Sometimes its only job was to point us toward a better one. But here's the funny thing. By the time we finish our tea, we've talked about a lot more than business. We've usually laughed, quite a bit. We've solved a few problems, created a few new ones, shared stories from the week, celebrated little victories, looked honestly at the things that didn't go the way we'd hoped. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without meaning to, we've nourished ourselves. Not because we crossed everything off a to-do list. Not because we suddenly became wildly productive. But because we took time to connect. I don't think we give enough credit to conversations like that anymore. Life moves fast. Everyone is busy. We're constantly connected to everyone, and somehow still don't spend enough time actually sitting down with the people we love. No phones demanding our attention every 30 seconds. No television talking over us. Just tea, conversation, time. That feels almost rebellious these days. Maybe that's part of what a harvest season is really inviting us to do, to stop long enough to notice what is feeding us, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, creatively, spiritually. One of the questions in this week's journal asks, "What truly nourished me this season?" I don't think my answer would be finishing another product or checking another task off my list. Those things are satisfying, but they aren't what fills me back up. For me, it's conversations. It's sitting across the table from someone I love while steam curls up from a cup of tea. It's watching one tiny idea become a much bigger conversation. It's laughing until neither one of us remembers how the discussion started in the first place. It's realizing that we're building something together, not just products, not just a business, a life, a rhythm, a tradition. Those Sunday afternoons have quietly become part of the season for me. You know, traditions have an interesting way of sneaking up on us. Sometimes we think traditions have to be grand. Holiday dinners, family reunions, big celebrations. But some of the most meaningful traditions are the little ones nobody else knows about. The Sunday cup of tea, the Friday pizza night, the morning walk with the dog, the 5 minutes you spend in the garden before work, the way you always light a candle before you start sewing. Those little rituals become the framework that holds ordinary life together. And because they happen quietly, we sometimes forget they're there at all, until one day we stop and realize, I would really miss this if it disappeared. I think that's worth paying attention to. Because if something quietly feeds your spirit every single week, it's probably worth protecting. Maybe that's another way of looking at harvest. Not just gathering things, gathering moments, gathering relationships, gathering traditions, gathering the little habits that remind us who we are. Those are harvests, too. And unlike vegetables, those are the kinds of harvests we can carry into every season. Of course, the other side of that journal page isn't nearly as much fun. The side that says, what drained me. If I'm being honest, that's usually the easier list to make. I don't even have to think very hard. It almost writes itself. The things that drained me this week, the things that took more energy than I expected, the things that looked like good ideas until I was halfway through them. Those are easy to remember. But one thing I've noticed during our Sunday tea is that we don't spend very long sitting in that list. We acknowledge it. We laugh about some of it. Sometimes we shake our heads and wonder what on earth we were thinking. Then we ask a different question. What can we do differently next week? Not because we're trying to become perfect. We've already established that ship sailed a long time ago. But because if something continually drains us, it's worth paying attention to. Maybe it needs to change. Maybe it needs to be simplified. Maybe it isn't ours to carry anymore. Or maybe it simply needs to wait until another season. I think that's one of the lessons nature tries to teach us every single year. There is a season for planting, a season for growing, a season for gathering, and there's also a season for letting the field rest. Farmers don't stand in an empty field in November wondering why nothing is growing. They understand that resting is part of growing. But we humans, well, we're a stubborn bunch. We expect ourselves to bloom all the time, to create all the time, to produce all the time, to always be improving, always fixing, always doing. Somewhere along the way, we started believing that slowing down meant falling behind. I don't think nature has ever been worried about falling behind. The oak tree doesn't compare itself to the sunflower. The blackberry bush doesn't apologize because it isn't producing apples. Everything grows according to its own season. And maybe we're allowed to do that too. You know, one of the things that comes up almost every Sunday is this question: do we really need to do all of that? Sometimes the answer is yes. Birthday parties have to happen when they're scheduled. Products have to be finished eventually. Podcasts don't magically record themselves, although if they ever start doing that, I'd like to know how. But sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes we've simply piled too much onto our own shoulders. Not because anyone asked us to, because we did. Maybe we thought we should. Maybe we got excited. Maybe we forgot that every time we say yes to something, we're also saying no to something else. That's the tricky part, isn't it? Time isn't really the thing we spend. It's our energy and our attention. Those are the things that quietly disappear. That's why I think this week's chapter asks such good questions. Not, what accomplished the most? Not, what made you look successful? Instead, what truly nourished you? What exhausted you unnecessarily? What are you ready to stop carrying? Those aren't productivity questions. They're life questions. I think if we answer them honestly every once in a while, our lives might start looking a little different. Maybe we'd say no more often. Maybe we'd protect our Sunday tea. Maybe we'd spend another 10 minutes watching the bubbles instead of answering one more email. Maybe we'd stop apologizing for taking care of ourselves. One of my favorite lines from this week's chapter says, "You are not required to carry every version of yourself forever." I sat with that sentence for a while because I think we've all had seasons where we became someone we needed to be. Sometimes we become incredibly strong because life demanded it. Sometimes we become cautious because we got hurt. Sometimes we become busy because busy feels safer than being still. Those versions of ourselves helped us survive. We can be grateful for them. But survival isn't always where we're meant to stay. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is thank that version of ourselves and let them finally rest. Maybe that's another kind of harvest. Not gathering more. Choosing. Choosing what is gentle enough, important enough, beautiful enough to carry with us when the wheel turns again. One of the crafts in this week's chapter is something called Harvest Keepsake envelopes. Now, if you've been hanging around Bubble Witch for any length of time, this probably won't surprise you. I have a slight weakness for tiny things. Tiny baskets, tiny journals, tiny matchboxes, tiny tins, little pockets, little envelopes. Basically, if something is miniature and looks like it might hold a tiny treasure, there's a pretty good chance I want one. Or 12. I've often wondered why we're so drawn to little containers. Maybe it's because they remind us that small things have value. A pressed flower, a tea label from a wonderful afternoon, a recipe card with butter stains on the corner because it's been loved for years, a photograph, a note from someone you care about, a tiny piece of fabric from a project that made you smile. None of those things take up much space, but together, they tell the story of a season. That's really what these little envelopes are for. They're not about storing clutter. They're about keeping evidence. Evidence that this season happened. Evidence that you laughed, that you created something, that you rested, that you noticed, that you were here. I think sometimes we believe memories only belong to the really big moments, the vacations, the holidays, the milestones. But when I look back through old journals or open little boxes I've tucked away over the years, it's almost never the big things that stop me in my tracks. It's the ordinary ones: a scrap of ribbon, a leaf that somehow survived being pressed between the pages, a receipt from somewhere that no longer exists. Those little pieces have a remarkable way of bringing an entire day back to life. Maybe that's why I enjoy making journals so much. Not because they have to become works of art, but because they become little time capsules. They're proof that we paid attention. And I think paying attention is one of the kindest things we can do for ourselves. The recipe this week made me smile too. Roasted honey vegetables. Simple, comforting. The kind of meal that fills the house with wonderful smells long before it's ready to eat. I've always thought there was something magical about that. Not fancy magic, kitchen magic. The kind that starts with chopping vegetables and putting a kettle on for tea. The kind that quietly tells everyone in the house, something good is coming. Food has always been one of the ways we gather. Not because every meal has to be elaborate, quite the opposite. Some of the meals I remember most weren't complicated at all. Fresh bread, soup, tea, jam, a plate of cookies shared over a conversation that lasted much longer than anyone planned. Sometimes the nourishment isn't just what's on the plate, it's who you're sharing the table with. And I think that's another lesson Lammas offers us. Gathering isn't only about storing food for the winter. It's about gathering the moments that sustain us, the people, the conversations, the traditions, the quiet little rituals that become part of who we are. Maybe that's why I look forward to Sunday tea every week. Yes, we plan, we dream, we organize. Okay, maybe not, but anyway. We talk about Bubble Witch, Pixie Productions, schedules, home life. But underneath all of that, we're really just making time for each other. The planning is almost an excuse. The real harvest is the hour we spend together. And if next Sunday we didn't get a single thing accomplished, if we simply drank tea and talked, I think it would still be time well spent. Because not every gathering has to produce something. Sometimes, the gathering itself is enough. Now, before we finish our tea together today, let's open the tiny season companion and see what little invitation is waiting for us this week. Let's see. This week's card is a rest card. It simply says, "Rest for 5 quiet minutes." I smiled when I turned it over, because after everything we've talked about today, it feels less like an instruction and more like permission. 5 quiet minutes, not 5 productive minutes, not 5 minutes to plan tomorrow, not 5 minutes to catch up on emails, just 5 quiet minutes, maybe with a cup of tea, maybe sitting outside while the cicadas sing. Yes, we are avoiding those creepy crickets. Maybe watching the evening light stretch a little longer across the yard. Maybe blowing a few bubbles and watching them drift wherever the breeze wants to take them. Or maybe just sitting quietly, doing absolutely nothing. We've become so accustomed to filling every empty space in our day that silence almost feels uncomfortable. But nature never seems uncomfortable with stillness. The fields don't apologize for resting after the harvest. The gardens don't rush towards spring before they've had their winter. The wheel simply keeps turning, and every season knows exactly when it's time to pause. Maybe we could learn something from that. So this week, I'd invite you to do exactly what the card suggests. Find 5 quiet minutes. Protect them. Don't earn them. Don't justify them. Just accept them as one small gift to yourself. And while you're sitting there, maybe ask yourself one simple question. What is truly worth carrying forward? I have a feeling you already know the answer. Whether you're following along with the Bubble Witch's little book of Lammas, or you're simply joining me here each week, thank you. Thank you for spending another little piece of the season with me. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself. Make a little magic, embrace a little mischief, accept the occasional chaos. And remember, the richest harvests aren't always the ones you can hold in your hands. Sometimes they're the conversations, the traditions, the people, and the quiet moments that remind you you were fully alive while this season passed by. I'll meet you again, somewhere between the bubbles and the tea.